Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kimberly Cloud Show. I'm your host, Kimberly Cloud. I have a very, very special guest here for the show today. Can you go ahead and announce to the world who you are and where you're calling from?
Absolutely. Kimberly, first of all, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much. And I appreciate everything that you do for your viewers. So thank you very much for your work.
You're
My
welcome.
name is Nate Blum, and I'm coming to you from not quite sunny, a little cloudy, but Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm out on my back patio, so I'm getting some fresh air and hearing some birds singing in my background.
It sounds beautiful. So, can you go ahead and tell me about your past leading up into your present, Nate?
Yeah, I grew up on a farm just south of York, Nebraska. It was a fourth generation farm. But I grew up in the 1980s and the farm crisis was a real thing, obviously. And so my cousins and I were told, go find some work somewhere else. There's nothing here for you on the farm, which is really unfortunate because there's actually a lot of opportunity in agriculture and on farms. And I wish we could change the narrative for our young people. But anyway, as a result, I left the farm and got a degree in psychology from the University of Nebraska. And shortly after, I ended up working for a congressman in the first congressional district of Nebraska. I worked for 5 years as director of ag policy and outreach, mostly in Nebraska, but occasionally in Washington, D.C. as well. And then that naturally led into my work for the Nebraska Grain Sorghum Board, which I did for 4 years as the executive director. And then that process also grew our international presence, which eventually morphed into what we now call Sorghum United, which is a global nonprofit. We've got about 3,000 stakeholders and growing on every continent except for Antarctica. We're very strong in South Asia. We're very strong in East Africa. We're going to be doing some work in South America here in July. And we're growing in Europe as well. So those stakeholders represent all points in the value chain for sorghum and millets. Not that we think sorghum and millets are necessarily better than any other grain, but these grains do have a lot of benefits for environment and health, and they're underutilized, underrepresented. So that's where we really focus. And how that plays into food security regionally as well. So that's really the sandbox that we play in. We also publish a series of children's books called the Sorgo Squad. That's actually how we fund our activities. We're a completely self-funded NGO. And those are published through my LLC, BlüMilo, and you can find them at sorgosquad.com. They're educational, but they're also fun. I describe them as Indiana Jones meets Captain Planet, and they're comic book style books. Which is important to me because I love comic books. So
I love the way you talk, and I'm sorry for cutting you off. It's just that I wanted to know more about the grains. You
yeah,
said there's a certain amount of grains, not a certain, but the grains that you um, have is more healthier. Tell me about the grains that aren't healthy that they're mass producing to us right now that you're trying to change that, or is that what I heard?
yeah. Well, our global food systems really do utilize only a handful of grains, and again, not that there's anything wrong with those grains, but they're not the most highly nutritive, right? So, for example, white rice, which is very common all over the world, I joke that it's essentially the iceberg lettuce of the grains world. I mean, there's just really not any nutrition there. And corn is also one that's widely used. And I live in Nebraska. We're the Cornhusker state, right? We produce more corn than just about anybody. But that means that comes at the expense of other possibly more nutritive grains. And in fact, I've got a great graph or chart I like to share, and I can send that to you via email for your website if you'd like. But it compares the nutritive values for sorghum and other millets as compared with corn and rice and wheat, et cetera, et cetera. What happens then also, because we're really focusing, our food systems are focusing on only these grains, what that means then also in American agriculture is that we get these monoculture cropping systems. So, for example, the farm I grew up on, we used to grow soybeans, wheat, and sorghum, or we call it Milo in North America, in rotation. So three crops in a rotation is really pretty good for soil health, water conservation, et cetera. Well, now, and for the last 30 years, that area has been corn on soybeans as a rotation. And that takes a lot out of the soil. But, there again, we can't blame our farmers if they don't have valuable markets for these other grains. And so trying to create regional food systems, even here in the US or abroad, other places as well, where we're having value added processing for these grains locally, can open up new markets for farmers, and allow for opportunities for direct contracting for our farmers, so they can mitigate the commodity marketing challenges in their other crops by maybe having an opportunity for local value addition within part of their rotation. So not trying to replace the commodity markets, but to supplement them with value addition.
Well said. And one last, well, not one last question, but I wanted to know more about the grains. So these grains are a supplement, or not trying to. They're not trying to supplement what you have, the corn and the rice and the other grains, but they're trying to help with the farmers as far as having an extra, piece of, you know, uh, grain for commodity, or however you said it.
Well,
Trying, go
yeah,
ahead.
I think I think the word supplement is actually a really good word for what we're trying to do, because what we're trying to do is supplement these grains into existing food systems
Yeah.
rather than replacing grains that are already being used. And that's really important because in America in particular, we have all of our systems are adversarial, right? Everything from our political systems to legal systems, business,
Mhm.
everything's adversarial. And so we don't want people to get the impression that we're saying you should have this instead of that. We're saying you should have this and that, right? So,
And that
or
would,
as I
that,
like to say, there's room on the plate for everyone.
that would make the revenue go up for the farmers, though, right? That would
Right.
make revenue,
Because
yeah.
what happens right now in American agricultural systems is that we really put a lot of emphasis on volume rather than value, right? So the only way to compete as a farmer is to grow, to get more and more acres under your belt, right? But what happens when we do that is, we're trying to grow as much as we possibly can, but our neighbor is going to do the same thing.
Okay.
And when you try to grow as much, let's pick on corn for a second. When you try to grow as much corn as you possibly can, that means you're going to be putting more fertilizers and things like that on it. You're going to be irrigating it more. So your input prices are all going to go up. And then when you harvest and your neighbor harvests at the same time, this is basic supply and demand. We know that if we flood the market then with a glut of a product, in this case corn, then our prices are going to go down. So inputs go up, our revenue goes down, and our margins shrink, right? And
And
in
they
a
lose money.
in a commodity market, we can't control the price, right? It's really dictated by the market.
They
So
lose money, right?
what's that?
They lose money when that happens.
Yeah, exactly. It can happen. I mean, that doesn't happen every year, but you're right. I mean, the margins get tighter. You can lose money in a bad year in that situation as well. And so what we're saying is, great. You know what? If you want your corn or your wheat or rice or whatever to play in the commodity market, that's fine. But let's find some local value addition, like a processor who's making some food, fuel, or fiber product using sorghum and millets, that you can direct contract before you ever put the seeds in the ground. And then you can mitigate your commodity marketing risk. There's always going to be marketing risk, right? But you can mitigate that by having a different kind of market. And why we say sorghum and millets is because, one, again, they're highly nutritive grains. They're really good for people and pets in diets. In fact, our fastest growing market in the U.S. is pet food. Birdseed, all your birdseed has sorghum and millets in it, by the way. But now your cat and dog food does too. And then in humans, we also know that it's really good for rebalancing the human gut microbiome. We're seeing research around the world that points to anti-inflammatory benefits, heart health benefits, anti-carcinogenic benefits. And because they're low on the glycemic index, it's actually really good for weight management and diabetes management as well. You stay fuller longer. And then on the environmental side, they use about a third of the water. Sorghum uses a third of the water of corn. Some millets, like foxtail, I think uses like a tenth of the water. And that's really important in areas that we're trying to conserve water in. They're drought resistant, drought tolerant. So just like your grass in your front lawn, if you don't get rain, your grass turns brown. But then when you do get some moisture on it, it perks back up, turns green again. Same thing with these grains. These grains are part of the Poaceae grass family. And so they behave very much like grass does.
Wow.
And then from a soil health standpoint, they have a very large root biomass that goes down about 6 feet in the soil. That means that it's leaving more biology in the soil, and the microbiology in the soil then eats that and grows. It also breaks up that compaction layer in the soil, which is common around the world, where there's this firm layer of the soil that's been compacted over time. When your weaker crops go down to it, like your corn or your wheat, for example, those roots go down, they hit that, and then they spread out. They can't penetrate it. And so that makes them actually less drought tolerant. So when you plant sorghum in rotation, it breaks that up, and then your subsequent crops in rotation then do better as well.
When will you see mass production with all of these grains you speak of? Like mass production where it's growing at a rapid rate, since they're doing everything to help the biology of our ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the sorghum belt, so to speak, is really South Dakota, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, a little bit of New Mexico. That's where we see the most. And that's because a lot of those areas are really dry. So when we talk about Nebraska, the part of the state that I'm in is corn on soybeans, because we have a fair amount of moisture here, right? But if you go to southwest Nebraska or even central Nebraska, where it's much drier, you'll start to see more sorghum in the rotation there. Same in Kansas, western Kansas. Kansas produces the most sorghum of any state in the U.S. That's where we're producing it. Now, processing it, that's another story. 80% of the world's supply of sorghum goes to China. 93% of U.S. supply of sorghum goes to China. What that means is it's a kind of when you have one customer in any business purchasing that quantity of your product, there's opportunity for that customer to kind of dictate the price through different means. And we see that happen actually with China. And it's not just soybeans, frankly. I think a third or every third row or every fourth row of soybean goes to China as well. We see that with corn with Mexico, because Mexico buys so much of our corn. So it's not just China either. So that's really an untenable situation for our farmers. And again, another reason why we should be looking at supplementing with more value-added markets here at home.
Which have farmers doing it themselves and distributing it amongst the stores, right?
Well, maybe not farmers, maybe it's processors. So India's got this figured out, by the way, because in India, and by the way, we have an office in Mumbai. We also are opening an office in Nairobi. So we're growing. But in India, a lot of these grains never truly went away from the diet. They kind of diminished, but they didn't really go away. And so there are a ton of processors that are making cookies or ragi or bread or whatever out of sorghum and millets. And so they've got the processing there. So they're working with the farmers, but it's not the farmers that are doing it. Here in the U.S., we'd like to bring some of these processors here, but it's always a question of startup costs, capital, all those things. I've got processors in Africa, Europe, South America, Asia, that would love to have operations in the U.S. It's a question of getting the capital to do it. So one thing that we're hopeful in the next couple of years that we can do is build a white label processing facility, be co-investors in that right here in Nebraska, so that we can allow these people to access the U.S. market a little more easily.
And what is the pros and the cons, and what prices are you looking at to invest in, if you don't mind me asking? What is the pros and cons of this grain that you want to, because it's already out there, but it's out there probably like between 30 and 40% in the United States, and you said like 90% goes or 80% goes to China, or you said Africa or Mexico. You said one of the two, but I wanted to know, because this is very educational. I've never heard of this. And this is I'm being honest, I've never heard of this. And this is very healthy. I have gut problems, and a lot of people suffer from gut problems because they're putting the wrong things in their stomach, and this could help a little bit, not just, if it goes to China, if all this product is going to China and being shipped to China, when it's being processed, how do we know what's being processed in it? We
Sure.
don't know.
Well, so
Go
to your point, we're not eating what goes to China. They're not sending it back here. Most
okay.
of what they use it for is to make something called baijiu. Baijiu is actually the most widely drank alcoholic spirit on the planet that most people have never heard of. But
I've never heard of it.
yeah, it's a cultural touchstone in China. So anytime you go to a formal dinner, they're feeding you shots of baijiu, and it's very, very popular there. It's really, really strong. It's like I don't know, triple distilled whiskey or something. I don't know, sure how they make it, but it's a cultural touchstone for them, and so that's why they really want it to be an inexpensive grain that they're getting from the U.S. But to your point on the gut, the one thing that I didn't mention earlier also is that sorghum is gluten free. So a lot of people who have celiac disease or just want to decrease their gluten, sorghum is a nice substitute for that. At my house, we eat it. We use it just like you would rice or in a flour, as long as it's an all-purpose flour blend that already has xanthan gum and a little bit of potato starch in it. We use it just like you would wheat flour. It's a little bit different to work with when you're using the flour. It's a little sticky once you put water in it and everything, like if you're making tortillas. So you just chill it in the fridge for a little bit and then you work with it, and it's fine. So, and the value for those markets, whether it's sustainability, gluten-free, non-GMO, which is another thing we have going for us. When we look at the market research globally, you're talking about markets for those traits in the billions of dollars, oftentimes with compound annual growth rates in the double digits. So from an investment standpoint, which is the question you asked me, we feel like there's a ton of opportunity in the market, looking at that data. In particular in the U.S., we have people that want this stuff already, right? Yeah. So we just need to leverage it and give it to them. But what we're not doing is we're not doing a good job of taking advantage of that and doing our processing. Instead, we send it out in boat loads at the lowest possible price.
Well, they are smart. China is very smart. They're our adversaries, but they're very smart. And to use it in an alcoholic drink is probably helping their tummy, because some people get hangovers and stuff. So
no, you will get a hangover from this, I promise you. No. I bought a bottle in China. I bought a bottle in China a few years ago. Although now there's a liquor store in Lincoln where I live that has 3 different varieties of baijiu. So if I really wanted it, I could buy it here. I describe it as it tastes like fire and regret all at the same time.
You're funny.
It's a great way to get rid of dinner guests, right? If they won't leave you after dinner, you'd be like, "Oh, hey guys, you break out a bottle of baijiu.
Really?
Let's take some shots." And all of a sudden, they're like, "Oh, look at the time, we got to go."
I love that. I really do. Tell me about. Okay, we're going to move on. Tell me about you working for the congressman for 5 years.
I got to tell you, I learned so much working for him, and
I can tell.
He was a tremendous mentor. He's a difficult guy to work for, as you can imagine. But once you've kind of been through that ringer, you can do anything. And there's a number of us former staffers. He's no longer in office, but there's a number of us former staffers who kind of graduated from that office and have gone on to do some pretty remarkable things, I think. And it's because, you just really learned not to ever leave your outcomes to somebody else. You learn to be accountable for every decision that you're making, and to keep quality and service at the very heart of everything that you do. So, I think I've always worked in kind of public service roles, and I don't think that's any different in where I work now. And everything that we do is for the people that we're working for. So it was.
Go ahead after you.
Well, I think you were going to ask me how I got that job.
Is that where you were? I'm going to ask you, how did you work your way up to get you're psychic. You're a psychic medium. Go ahead.
Well, it's funny. So when I first graduated from the university, and I started a family, by the way, before I went to school. So if any young people are watching this, I would tell you don't do that, but it's not impossible. So I worked overnights in an emergency room while I went to the university during the day and raised kids. So for about 5 years, I only slept for 3 hours a day or so. Yes, thank you. But if I got to tell you, it's possible, but my grades were not great. So anyway, so when I graduated, it was almost 10 years after I graduated high school when I finished college. And that would have been in 09 when I graduated. And those of you who remember 09, we had an economic crash and there were no real jobs available. But I didn't want to keep working in the ER, which, by the way, I love the ER. I did it for a total of about 10 years, splints, EKGs, wound irrigations, those types of things. It was awesome. Loved it. But as I like to say, that was 40 pounds ago. And it's a young person's job. So anyway, in 09, when I graduated, the only job I could find was as a financial advisor. So I got my Series 7, my Series 66, but realized very quickly I did not like doing that. But as part of growing my practice, I volunteered with the Alzheimer's Association. This is a common way for financial people to kind of network and grow, is find something you're passionate about and go volunteer. So I volunteered for the Alzheimer's Association, and they sent me to Washington for their annual conference. It was the first time I'd ever been to Washington, D.C. This would have been in 2010, I think. And anyway, so I go, and while I'm there, I realized that Nebraska's delegation has a really cool thing that we do called the Nebraska Breakfast. And that is every Wednesday that they're in session. Both the senators and congressmen from Nebraska have a large breakfast, and anyone from Nebraska that's going to be on the Hill that day can come and visit. They hear updates about what the delegation's doing. It's a great way to see all of them all at the same time. So the day we were supposed to be on the Hill was Nebraska Breakfast. I did the tourist thing and said, hey, I want to go to this. And I was the only one out of my group that went, because it's early in the morning. It's like 7 a.m. And I realized about halfway through that they were announcing the people who were in attendance, and then those people would stand and have a few minutes to talk about why they were in Washington. And I'm a little slow, especially that early in the morning. But I realized, oh my God, I'm going to have to speak. And I was not a good public speaker at the time. So anyway, they announced my name. I stood up. I think Ben Nelson at the time was the one who announced me. But I stood up and, just regurgitated everything that they had told us in the conference the day before, right? And afterwards, this congressman came up to me and says, wow, you really did a good job. You did a good job today. I said, okay, that's nice. It's great. So throughout the day doing our Hill visits, I ran into him several times, and every time he says, you really did a good job at the breakfast. And then I stayed a couple days later to do the touristy stuff and see all the museums and whatever. And turns out my flight on that Friday, he was on that flight. And so I walked by him on my way to my seat, and he says, hey, Nate, I remember you did a great job at the breakfast. So fast forward about 6 months, I'm working as a financial advisor, absolutely hating it. But I did the most naive thing you could possibly do. I wrote a letter to this congressman and included my resume. And I said, I'm not asking you for a job, but here's what I'm good at. Everybody in the district. If you think you can find something that I would be good at, I'd love to know, because I don't like what I'm doing now. And nothing wrong with financial advising, by the way. One of my best friends is now my financial advisor, but I'm not a numbers guy, and I'm not a detail guy, and you don't want me doing detail work because it doesn't work that way. Anyway, so I wrote him this letter, and lo and behold, 2 weeks later, I get a phone call. I remember I was taking our youngest daughter, who is now 15. She just turned 16. At the time, I was taking her sledding. And I get this letter, this phone call from an unknown number, and I answer it. And of course, it's this congressman. And he says, hey, I remember you from the breakfast. I've got your letter here. We just had a position open up. It's not something we can advertise for. Would you want to come in and talk about it? So he had no business hiring me. I had no political or policy experience, but he knew I had agricultural experience, and he knew I could speak. And that's why he hired me. And what I learned through that process is, and this is a good thing I like to tell young people when I'm talking to students all the time. So again, my degree's in psychology, and here I am, running a global organization that focuses on food security, right? What business do I have doing that? But if you can understand how people think, and you can learn how to communicate, both written and verbally, you can really do anything. That's what I've learned. If you're willing to learn, you're willing to understand how other people are learning and how they're thinking and communicating, and you're able to meet them in the middle, you can really do anything.
Well said. And where do you see yourself sense you can do anything going for the future, Mr. Nate.
Ever
I'll mess up on your last name again.
Blum, that's okay. I that's always an interesting question because I think that I've been fairly successful in my professional career, but I've never had a plan for the next thing. It's just always kind of grown into the next thing. So when I worked for the congressman, my father passed away about 4 years in, which meant I had to understand how to run the farm again. I hadn't been on the farm in 15 years or so at that time. A lot of changes in agriculture very quickly, especially here in the U.S. And so I went to the university, went back to where I graduated from, and found an agricultural leadership development program that helped me not only understand how agriculture had changed and how to manage my farm, but it also taught me how to do, again, more public speaking, be a leader, how to get involved and do these things. And, that really changed quite a bit for me. And that helped me understand that I wanted to be more directly involved in agriculture. And so after that experience, a friend of mine told me I should apply for this job at the Nebraska Sorghum Board. Their director was retiring after 38 years. So I was only the second director they'd ever had. And during that time, again, just like before, I'd never run an organization before. They had no business probably hiring me. But they also didn't have a big budget. And I was what they could afford. But during that time, I learned how to do even more things. And we grew production in Nebraska of sorghum acres by about 130% in the course of 4 years, by the way. Good. And we did that a lot just through outreach and telling our story. And through outreach and telling our story, we also grew our international network through social media to the point where I'd go on trade missions and people would specifically ask for Nebraska sorghum because that was the name that they knew. Again, through that, it grew our international group where a bunch of us came together and said, hey, we're going to compete on certain levels, sure. But our challenges are really the same wherever we go in the world. So why don't we find some ways to work together and make the pie bigger rather than arguing over the same piece? And, that was a loose organization for about a year. And then with the International Year of Millets, which was 2023, I found myself actually December 2022 was the opening ceremony for that at the United Nations in Rome. And I was there and I found that I was the only person from North America that was there. No one else in the industry was there. And I realized that if we were going to drive the International Year of Millets outside of Asia and Africa, we had to be our own thing. And so I came home and much to my wife's chagrin and trepidation, I quit my job and we focused only on Sorghum United, making it an actual full-blown NGO, figuring out our funding mechanisms. Fortunately, we were in a financial position to be able to do that. We were very blessed. And now, like I said, we've got a presence all over the world. I have offices on other continents. I still get to be home on occasion. You see my daughters wandering around the back while I'm doing a live interview, which they shouldn't be doing, but here we are. And it's a blessing to be able to do that too. So
can I ask you a question before we end? This is the last. You said agriculture has changed over the course of a decade when you went in or whatnot. What do you think is going to change another decade from now with agriculture? What are they talking about with agriculture changing for the next decade to 2 decades coming on?
Yeah, well, it's really from a mechanical perspective, it's robotics. We're starting to see, first of all, drones have done wonders for precision agriculture because now farmers don't have to spray as much chemical or whatever, whether it's herbicide or pesticide or nitrogen or whatever it is. They don't have to apply as much because with precision agriculture and with drones, it can be applied to specific parts of a field that need it rather than the whole thing. That's a big deal. That's a big deal for the environmental factors and everything else. And we're seeing that grow. More satellite imagery is being incorporated into agriculture as well. And then from a robotic standpoint, we're seeing more pilotless tractors and things like this. But even those combines and other tractors that are out there, I think most of your viewers who are outside of agriculture would be astounded if they sat in one of those. There are so many computer monitors. A lot of them are satellite guided even. I mean, it's not sows, cows, and plows anymore. It's not like it was even 20 years ago. So that's a big thing that's changing. And then from a cropping systems standpoint, and what I'm talking about is those rotational crops, we're seeing more cover cropping. We're seeing more double cropping, which allows us to retain more water and things like this. We're starting to understand better that dirt is not dirt. Soil is actually a living microbiome in and of itself. So that's really important. And we're starting to see some better governmental policies through USDA that are promoting these additional grains rather than just, the corn and soybeans. There's still a lot of work to do in revamping crop insurance. And there's a lot of work to do in figuring out what carbon markets look like and, which crops are better for carbon sequestration. Although research from Texas A&M shows us that sorghum is a great carbon sink because of that large root biomass. It captures more carbon, buries it deeper and longer in the soil. So we're starting to see some incentives around that as well. And then I think as our consumers kind of become a little more savvy around their food, and what they're eating, I think as that demand changes to want and demand more grains like sorghum and millets, which is a big part of my job, is just that educational piece, then that'll drive change on the farm also in the cropping systems. Farmers will grow whatever they can sell. So I don't like it when people get on farmers and say, well, it's their fault. They're doing monoculture cropping. And no, I mean, I've got farmers in Nebraska that would love to have sorghum in their rotation, but if they don't have a market for it, how can you ask them to sell it? Environmental sustainability has to start with economic sustainability. We have to be thinking about that for our farmers too.
Well said, by the way. Well said with everything you said. You were challenging yet very funny, very smart, and very well educated, and your speech is very well rounded, and I like having you on my show.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming on. You taught me a lot. When I mean a lot, I mean a lot. So thank you for being on my show. How can the people reach you?
Yeah, well, my direct phone number, this is very important to me, my direct phone number and email are on our website at sorghumunited.com. That's SORGHUM united.com. And also on the Sorgo Squad, SORGHO squad.com websites. You can also find me on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, all those. I think we have a TikTok account, but I don't use it. So who knows? But if it's out there, we're on it. So.
Thank you so much. Stay on the line. Thank you guys for watching the show today. He was an awesome guest, and I hope to be in your shoes. Hopefully you inspired me. So take care, be safe, and I'll see you later.
Thank you so much, Kimberly.